This is the BioCentury Show. Brought to you by the 24th Bioequity Europe, scheduled for May 2024 in San Sebastian, Spain. Join BioCentury EBD Group and Regional Host Committee Chair Isios Capital for Biotech's premier CEO and investor conference in one of the culinary capitals of the world.
Hello, I'm Steve Usden, BioCentury's Washington editor, and today I'm speaking with Renee Wegrzyn, Director of the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, ARPA-H. President Biden appointed Dr. Wegrzyn to be the first director of ARPA-H in October 2022. ARPA-H was inspired by the successes of DARPA, where she worked prior to joining Ginkgo Bioworks, a synthetic biology company. Dr. Wegrzyn, let's start at the beginning. A bit over a year ago, you were put in charge of ARPA-H. You were given $2.5 billion to invest over 3 years in a mission to advance the health of the American people. It's pretty exciting, but maybe a little scary, I would think, especially since the ARPA ethos calls for very rapid results. How did you go about setting up ARPA-H, and what are some of the most important accomplishments from your first year?
Yeah, I think thanks for mapping out exactly where we came from. It's hard to believe that was just a year ago. Some days it feels like that was a decade ago because we've been moving so quickly. But I want to myth bust one thing that you said. So it's true that ARPA's moved very quickly, but sometimes the seeds that we plant in terms of the results for the projects we might not see for 10, 15 years, right? Part of the ARPA of the agency is really looking for those high risk but potentially high payout efforts that if you kind of start to pursue an effort to show that something is possible, you can really start to plant those seeds. DARPA, some great examples are the internet and stealth technology, right? Those weren't really developed overnight, but the seeds were planted by DARPA to show, hey, there's something here that then the private sector, that other public funds can bring forward. And we're really here to take on that bold and rapid fire ARPA business model, but to do that exactly for health. And then I know we'll get into this a little bit in our conversation, some of the specific projects that we've launched that we think are the seeds that could maybe bring one of the next moonshots moving forward.
So ARPA-H was created because a lot of people are frustrated by the pace of medical innovation and by a sense that science isn't being turned into medicines at a pace that matches the scale of the investment or the urgency of the needs. So ARPA-H's mission is to do things that can't readily be accomplished by the traditional research community or by commercial activity, because if they can, why would you do it? How do you identify projects that are in that space of things that are really important, things that NIH and other traditional funders aren't going to get accomplished, and things that biotechs and venture capitalists aren't going to get done in the absence of ARPA-H? How do you define things and find things that are in that sweet spot?
Yeah, that's what we do every day. So the approach that we take, if we look at some of the foundational research that happens in the federal government, it's incredibly important. We absolutely need it, but it's not what ARPA-H funds. We're not here to be a long-term funder. It's really what is something that seems to be impossible today, and let's invest in that and see if it is possible, get to a proof of concept and bring that forward. There aren't a lot of other places in the federal funding ecosystem that allow for that. And on the flip side, in the private sector, we like to say, if a venture capitalist says, come back to me when you've demonstrated X, we want to fund X. We want to take on that high risk piece that if we de-risk that, then we can line up those downstream funders. And so, some of our initial investments, I think, are really aligned to that. The other secret piece I want to share with you about the ARPA model is we aren't predetermined in terms of how we spend our funds. There isn't a specific disease we're looking at or a specific technology. Instead, we look for program managers that come to ARPA-H and say, hey, I'd like to come on board, join your team for a term appointment. We offer them 3 years to start, but they bring with them a big problem in health that they want to fund. And so one of our first programs that we launched called Nitro was focused on reversing osteoarthritis. What if joints could heal themselves? So that program manager not only identified this is not being done by the fundamental research community, VCs aren't ready for this because we haven't sufficiently de-risked that technology. And the pace at which this program manager, Ross Urich, wanted to move forward was perfectly aligned to some of the authorities and contracting mechanisms that ARPA had. So it's really finding that champion, the person, but also the problem that's a great fit for ARPA-H. And then when you find it, then you hit the ground running to pursue those big efforts.
So I've actually got some questions I'm going to ask you a little bit later about nitro, but one of the first ones is, how far is ARPA-H going to take things? So you mentioned, de-risking it so that a venture capitalist would invest in it. Is that what your goal is to take things far enough so that the private sector will invest in them, or are there going to be cases where you're going to take things farther than that?
Yeah, so again, it's not predetermined. There isn't a stopping point that every ARPA-H project has to stop at. We really fund the entire continuum in terms of technology readiness, and we'll determine that on a case-by-case basis. So if there's a rather mature technology that somehow hasn't been adopted by the marketplace, we want to understand that. Is it just because there isn't a market for it, or is there maybe a last mile delivery challenge? Those are the things that we might invest in to bring something forward. But really, that is part of when our program managers design programs, they actually answer a series of 10 questions that help answer just some of the questions that you have there. And so they're called the Heilmeyer questions. We've adopted them from DARPA. George Heilmeyer was an early director of DARPA, but we've added a few extra questions that really align to the mission of ARPA-H. And so I won't say all the questions, but to give you a general idea, the first ones are aimed at, what is the specific problem you're trying to solve? How is it done today? And importantly, what is fundamentally new and game-changing in your approach? We want to hear that from the program managers. Then there's some questions about how much will it cost? How long will it take? And then from the ARPA-H side, it's really thinking about how are you going to address cost, accessibility, and user experience? We want to make sure we create products and tools that don't sit on a shelf because nobody likes them or doesn't want to use them. We want them to be enthusiastically adopted. And so in that spectrum of questions I just shared with you, you could see how something can start and be sparked in a laboratory, but has to bridge and get into that real world where it's something that's affordable and that people want to use. And so we really challenge each of our program managers to think about their projects holistically and how they might address that.
It sounds a lot like the conversations that every biotech CEOs has when they go in to see a VC also, similar questions. But there is something different about, a lot of things are different actually about ARPA-H. So when I first wrote about ARPA-H, I said that it has ideals about equity and inclusion woven into its DNA. How are you making those ideals real?
Yeah, so first of all, through some of those Heilmeyer questions, so cost and accessibility really at its core is an equity question. We want to make sure that is being addressed as part of those programs. We won't give a program manager the funds to move forward with an effort unless they have a plan to address that. We also, I'll take Nitro again as another example of a program where by the end of the 5 years of that program, we will move into the clinic if we're successful with the development of those technologies. And there's a requirement to enroll a clinical trial that matches the demographics of disease. And so that is unusual to be tasked with for federal funding, but it's a way that we want to ensure that we are developing solutions that really serve the populations that need it the most. Those are just a couple of examples. The last one I'll mention is we recently launched a nationwide health innovation network, in part to bring us closer to those communities that our program managers are going to serve through their programs. And so having simple ways to interact with non-traditional communities who may think about working with the government and say that's too hard. I don't have a grant writing shop, or maybe you're a 3-person startup and you don't have the resources to afford. We use very simple, it's called other transactions, a way of doing business that makes it feel more like a business-to-business transaction than a big government to business or to community health lab interaction. So really try to address it from many different angles, Steve.
So on Nitro, you talked about the clinical trial diversity goals. One of the things I looked at the specifications for it, it said that the goal is to enroll about 20% Native Americans or Native Alaskans in the trials of the products, and that's a kind of, it says it more or less explicitly, that's a go or no go. If the organizations are getting money from ARPA-H can't assure you that they can do that, then you're not going to fund them. Why 20% Native Americans or Native Alaskans? I think they make up about 3% of the U.S. population. And how would how would somebody go about doing that?
Yeah, so a couple of reasons. Again, looking at the demographics of disease, there is a significant representation of Native American, Native Alaskan already in the demographics of that disease. So it's important to serve those communities. A lot of those communities are also harder to reach, whether they're on reservation lands or are in more rural settings. And so really the program manager is making a statement of, you have to solve for all of these challenges. And that the clinical part doesn't come to the end of the program, but it's understood from day one of the program. We're already starting to build those bridges to make sure we're successful by the end of that program. And so we haven't announced yet the teams that we're funding. That's kind of an active process right now. But as you noted, that's a very important key part of every proposal, that they need to have a reasonable, feasible strategy of how to address that. We intend to help our teams through ARPA-H, this nationwide health innovation network that will help bring us closer to those communities. We can help recruit, maybe it's a clinical center, maybe it's a community lab to help close that gap. The program manager has also recently made strides with the Native American community by hosting an animal model workshop right here in the Washington, D.C. region at the Museum for the American Indian, convening an important group that was representing some of the demographics of that disease, but also bringing together key players, including FDA, to get agreement on an animal model that is going to be required as part of the preclinical studies for this effort. And so it's really a testament of what program managers do. That second question, how's it done today? When that program manager was developing the program, said, you know what, there doesn't seem to be a really key way to be approaching these animal models. Everybody does it in a different way. And so we need to have some sort of harmony as we move forward if we really want to get this to the clinic. So we're really willing to tackle it from all different angles.
So one of the other things in the NITRO program is that there's a requirement that it be made available at a quarter or less of the cost of standard of care today. And I'm wondering, how do you go about doing that? How do you engineer that into the program? And are you going to have, for example, explicit regulation of what companies can charge, or whoever it is that's going to develop this technology can charge once it's commercialized?
Yeah, I think this is really a nod to the levers that an ARPA has, right? When you impose a restriction on the performer community, having come from DARPA, I've seen this play out many times, where at first they balk at the requirement, but then say, okay, this is the parameter. If you had to manufacture your cells in a different way, your approach, your therapeutic in a different way, how would you fundamentally do that differently? And we're requiring that of them. And so if you put that requirement up front, it really changes the way that you can approach supply chain. It changes the way that you approach scale and some of the reagents. And so this is where we hope, in some ways, by providing those guidelines, we actually spark innovation. And that's what we're looking for through making broad statements like that, and are looking for the performers that are willing to rise to that challenge. It's another reason why ARPA-H is funding these efforts, right? These are what we would call ARPA hard challenges, right? If anybody can do it, everybody else would be funding it. But the restrictions that you've just outlined so very clearly that we've put as part of the programs, we really want to use ARPA-sized resources to be able to get there and solve those really, really hard challenges, because we know if we solve that for nitro, we may also advance the state of the art for multiple cellular therapies well beyond osteoarthritis. We really want to try to make these strides, not just for the one disease indication that we may be funding in a focused way, but we know that will bleed into the rest of the ecosystem.
So are you going to have explicit price regulations, what NIH in the past has called reasonable pricing clause, for example, in the agreements that you have with whoever's going to manufacture these products?
So this is an active process. Again, we don't have those final contracts in place, but stay tuned for those announcements in the first quarter of next year to get those additional details of what the terms of those final agreements look like.
Maybe
I should just add, I think what's helpful for you to think about ARPA-H is we're not a regulator. We're not a policymaker. ARPA-H is really, we want to innovate through technology, and we want to, the primary lever that we're going to use to drive down cost is a fundamentally different approach to how you manufacture, how you address supply chain. The big levers that we use at ARPA-H are not going to be policy, regulation, and terms, even though some of those might be peppered in some of the contracts, especially around data sharing, et cetera. The big levers that we want to innovate on are on the technology side. That's our role in this ecosystem.
Yeah, and it may be, that in cell therapies and in gene therapies, that a large part of the cost is actually in what it actually costs to manufacture these things. And a lot of the things that you might be doing that result in drugs, for example, small molecule or biologic drugs, the cost isn't really a function of the manufacturing cost or even of the R&D cost, right? It's there are other commercial considerations. Do you see yourself going there? Do you see yourself trying to impact the pricing or using other levers to ensure accessibility?
I think I'm not the only one who agrees that the price of a lot of therapeutics today have really gotten out of hand. And so I would love ARPA-H to be in a role to drive down through innovation, driving down the cost of a lot of these of these technologies. And as you note, though, not all of those costs are only the result of the manufacturing or whatever that case may be. There are some other levers through our authorities that I think are pretty interesting for us to be able to pursue. So, for example, ARPA-H can directly reimburse to FDA for working together with us and helping advance some of the innovations that we fund to bring them across the finish line. So we're looking at other ways to incentivize industry. For example, maybe, and I'm just making this up on the spot, but just to give you a concrete example, maybe we fund a group to develop a cellular therapeutic for osteoarthritis, but we encourage a company to also share all of the pre-competitive data that they might have developed on other cell lines that maybe aren't part of that final package, but having that data at FDA, having that shareable with the broader ARPA-H community is going to help us develop the next AI technology to predict and further drive down the cost of manufacturing, et cetera. So we're trying right now in our first year, again, just standing up these efforts for the first time, what are some of the levers that we can also incentivize industry to want to innovate with us without, being the regulator and the policymaker that actually sets pricing.
Well, thanks. We have to take a quick break, but when we come back, I want to talk to you more about some of the specifics of some of the projects that you're funding and also about the relationship with FDA that you just alluded to. We'll be right back.
For more than 20 years, BioEquity Europe has been where CEOs and investors gather to network, partner, and debate critical issues facing the biotech industry. In 2024, BioEquity heads to San Sebastian, Spain, in Basque Country, May 12th to 14th. Join BioCentry, EBD Group, and Regional Host Committee Chair Iseos Capital in one of the world's culinary capitals for a destination event designed for CEOs, investors, and decision-makers across the global biopharma ecosystem. In 2023, 300 VCs and 330 biotech CEOs joined BioEquity in Dublin, Ireland. In San Sebastian, the program will feature more than 100 emerging biotechs that will present their story to investors and potential partners. Don't wait, last year's BioEquity conference sold out. Visit bioequityeurope.com for more information.
I'm back with Dr. Renee Wegrzyn, the director of ARPA-H. One of the questions that people ask me when they think about ARPA-H, when I talk to them about it, is they ask whether ARPA-H is going to take an equity stake in any of the companies that it funds or that it partners with.
No, it's a very simple answer to that question. So, we're definitely non-dilutive capital. We really want to push these innovations out, and where we want to be a customer of the companies that develop these technologies, the universities that develop these technologies ultimately, and by we, I mean all Americans really want to be a customer here. The federal government wants to be a customer. So, our interest is in really getting the technologies out there.
So, you mentioned before the break. FDA, and you mentioned relationship with FDA. Can you talk a little bit about how ARPA-H plans to or could work with FDA, because you've made collaborating with FDA one of your explicit goals?
Yeah, well, right from the moment I got in the door, we've been engaged deeply with FDA. So we know that one of the key steps in the bridge of getting something from a research lab into the real world is most likely to involve FDA at some point. And so we've actually engaged across the different centers at FDA already. We brought our program managers and our leadership over to the FDA campus, in fact, and spent a day together to get them familiar with our model, but also understand from their side, what are they excited about? They're also a campus full of innovators that are eager for places like ARPA-H to challenge them, right? Of course, they know how to regulate small molecule drugs, but what about a never before newly seen, molecular technology? We want to make sure that we're engaging early on so that when we are at the stage that we may have a product that's ready to be reviewed and regulated, that they even have the reviewers on staff. And so it's a little bit of a misconception, at least in my experience. It's true that FDA regulates products, but they are also eager to engage early on in the development of new technologies. And so we really want them engaged early as partners, helping us understand if we fund collection of data that demonstrates X, is that going to be useful to you? Or do you also need Y and Z, and help us understand? Because we want to de-risk things so that they make them out into the real world. And so that guidance from FDA, even if it's unofficial, is really, really helpful. The other thing I'll say is that FDA is really I think up to the data challenge. A lot of their leadership comes from private sector previously in the data universe, and so that's an area that especially with the advent of some of the new capabilities in AI and beyond, we're really excited to collaborate with them. And so we put an RFI out, in fact, a request for information together with FDA earlier this year, where we sought information from the private sector to say, if we want to incentivize things like getting to market more quickly or data sharing, what incentives would actually be really exciting to you? Is ARPA-H funding enough? Or are you looking for is it priority review? We really wanted to hear that perspective from industry, because that can also help shape our collaboration with FDA going forward. And then I'll just give you one other notable example. On a case-by-case basis, we'll bring in FDA. I mentioned the lack of an animal model for osteoarthritis. So they were partners and eager to jump in right away, because not only could that help our potential performers that we're going to fund under that effort, but really the whole community that's working on osteoarthritis could benefit with additional clarity around those animal models.
So I think you mentioned earlier ARPA-H. It's got an ambitious goal. It's got several ambitious goals, but one of them is a goal of enabling 90% of eligible Americans to take part in a clinical trial within a half hour of their home. I think you're calling that advancing clinical trial readiness. Can you talk a little bit about what ARPA-H is, and what is it that ARPA-H can do to achieve a goal like that?
Yeah, so ARPA-H is really a nod to looking at how ARPA-H is different from other ARPAs. And so if you look at DARPA, successful projects and programs at DARPA ultimately can rely on the Department of Defense to help bring those new capabilities across the finish line. There's a very clear transition partner there. That doesn't exist for health. Health and Human Services, HHS, is not that downstream funder and advanced developer for health. It's the private sector. Each of our states has a different approach to how they even approach healthcare. So it's a very different ecosystem. And we knew from the very beginning at ARPA-H, to be successful, we needed to help create that transition community for us. And so we actually competed a nationwide competition to look for 2 hubs that would help us with our customer experience. This is bringing us closer to patients for clinical trials, for prototyping, let's say a new diagnostic test. Our customer experience hub was awarded to Dallas, Texas, for their ability to recruit all 50 states, but also have this really unique ecosystem inside of Texas to help us close that gap. That's one part of the ARPANET. The other is focused on investor catalysts. So as I said, our funding is transactional. We're going to demonstrate that something is possible, de-risk efforts, but then we need to get it out there into the private sector or into philanthropy, or maybe even into states. And that's where our Investor Catalyst Hub, based out of Cambridge, Massachusetts, is going to help us engage those partners across the country. So now when we're launching programs, we can really activate this entire network to say, you might want to be funded by this project, but how can you help us also be that market pull and get us across the finish line? Either if you're a customer and want to help give feedback on the product, or maybe you're that investor that wants to pull it across the finish line. And so the bringing it to the actor, the accelerating clinical trials readiness, is an example of a network activation where we say, okay, we know that we're going to need to do clinical trials for ARPA-H broadly for all of our programs. And rather than stand those up on a program by program basis, let's start to build this infrastructure that supports the entire agency as a longer term capability. And so that's what ACTOR, which is now just recently announced, is going to help us do.
And can you talk a little bit more about the investor catalyst? Because I think a lot of people who are watching this are going to be interested in that. Does that mean that you're going to have investors potentially as partners in projects from their inception, or that you're going to be getting input from investors as you develop them to be able to make a kind of a handoff? How's that going to work? What are the goals?
Yeah. All of the above. So we've already engaged investors very early in our program. So if a program manager wants to launch a project on, let's say, pandemic preparedness, really understanding what is the marketplace for that today, to ensure one that program manager has all the right players at the table when the announcement comes out. So if we think there's groups that are ready to compete, make sure that this news hits them, but also make sure that we're addressing something that's not being currently funded by the ecosystem. So we need to engage that investor community at that point. Maybe they're also funding a small co that would be a great performer. We want to hear from them as well. We want to know what we should be when we're developing our milestones for programs. What do we need to demonstrate so that they can pick up funding on the back end? And then we've invited investors even to our proposers days, and we describe a capability to let them have a voice and say, if these teams are successful, we'll be here at the finish line to help pick up some of these technologies. The last piece of that I should mention is government doesn't always do a great job at staffing private sector management teams. And so when we hopefully launch new companies out of ARPA-H, again, engaging that investor network to help identify the right people that might be able to staff those teams is going to be really, really important. And it may be regionally specific. We want to make sure that we're bridging that gap. And I think that regionally specific piece is a really important one. If you just imagine your audience will have a really easy time to do this. If you think about where's biotech investing in the United States today, and then where are some of the biggest disease burdens, those are often non-overlapping maps, right? So if we just take stroke, for example, Southeast United States is where the largest burden of stroke is, but that's not where the largest investment in biotech is. And so the Investor Catalyst Hub is to help us bridge those gaps to that the communities that really need that investment and innovation, that we're making very clear pathways to get it to them.
So you've got about a half a dozen projects that are programs, I guess you call them, that you're funding, but you also have these broad agency announcements, BAAs. What is it? What is that? How does it work? I noticed that one of the first ones that you gave was to a biotech company, Thymune Therapeutics, a company that George Church and John Maraganore involved in. How does that work? How's that different from the other things that you're doing?
Yeah, so our programs are really driven by program managers. So the 6 that we have announced, Nitro being one of them, are really those ideas of the program managers that they come here to do the job to launch those programs. We know that ARPA-H does not have a monopoly on all the good ideas, though, and many of the good ideas come from the outside community. So the open broad agency announcement is really like open aperture, send us your great ideas, and we may fund them. And we've tried to make it simple where it's a 3-page abstract. So we don't want you to spend a ton of time. We want to have a quick evaluation on our side. Let's see if there's a there. And if we're excited about the project, we'll invite a full proposal to fund. And so those initial efforts that you mentioned, funded from the Open BA, really fall into those examples of things that we don't think are being funded elsewhere in the ecosystem, but really truly represent ARPA hard challenges that we're willing to take a bet on. And the Thymune example was the first biotech company that we funded out of the agency to start to bridge some of those gaps.
And do those have the same kind of active management and milestone requirements as your programs do?
Absolutely. So what happens when an open broad agency announcement comes in, and when a submission comes in and we decide that we like it and we want to fund it, there's a matchmaking process that happens inside the agency. So those open broad agency announcement projects get matched with a program manager who then will manage that effort. And we try to match skill sets, but we only have a small cadre of program managers and a very broad portfolio. So you may get a program manager who's a biomedical engineer that comes into into a cancer project and injects some new expertise into that effort. And it's really, for me, it was one of the best parts of being at DARPA. And I hope our program managers feel that here, that you can really develop a very unique portfolio. You may be an expert in gene editing, but maybe you're really excited about some new detection technologies and want to be able to add that to your broad portfolio. And that's a really unique thing that ARPA-H allows our program managers to do, is to diversify their own investments here.
So I want to kind of quickly, because we are running out of time, ask you about some of the specific projects. One of them, antigens predicted for broad viral efficacy through computational experimentation, what are you calling APEC, which, as I understand it, you're trying to develop broad spectrum vaccines that will go across a whole family of viruses. And I'm wondering what's ARPA-H's role there? I mean, you've got companies, Moderna, I know they're spending $3 billion this year on R&D, and there's a lot of other biotech and biopharma companies investing in vaccines, including in broad spectrum ones. NIH's NIAID has been investing in universal flu vaccines for more than a decade. There's CEPI. It's not a space that is devoid of investment or scientific attention. What is it that ARPA-H brings to that, and what do you think you're going to, what's your goal that you're going to achieve that other players can't do?
Yeah, I think a really important part of any ARPA-H project is to deconflict with the rest of the ecosystem. We don't want to be redundant. And what Andy Kiliansky, the program manager who is managing this project, has done is really talk with a lot of those, NIAID, of course, our brothers and sisters at NIH, but broader international partners who are looking at their funding, which tends to be kind of falling into small categories of a few specific viruses. What Andy wants to do is say, let's look at the entire spectrum of viruses that we have absolutely not addressed yet, and try to have, using AI ML technologies, new approaches that really knock out entire classes of those viruses. And so, we have to get a new booster every year for many of these viruses, or some cases vaccines don't exist at all. And we want to start to address that market that is so far underserved. Part of this, in a way, is also to, Andy comes out of our Health Science Futures office, is to say, what does the future of vaccine technology look like if you could really interrogate with the full suite of protein-based medical countermeasures, nucleic acid-based medical countermeasures, and now AI/ML technology. And that, in a holistic way, has not yet been done before. And that's really what we want to push the state of the art on through this program. It's not to say it wouldn't ever get there from the private sector, but we think it would probably be more like, downstream 10, 15 years from now. We want to really accelerate that pace.
So we're running out of time. One final question. One of the kind of aspects of the ARPA model is that program managers are there for 3 years or at maximum 6 years, right? And so I'm wondering, does that apply to you? What are your plans? How long do you expect to be there, and what are your goals to achieve in the period of time that you're there?
Yes, so the Congress has decided what my term limits are. So in our statute, the ARPA-H director has a base 4-year term and then renewable for up to another 4 years. So I am a presidential appointee, so it'll be up to the president in 3 years from now to decide if I stay on board or if they're going to look for fresh blood, which is completely appropriate. That's like the beauty of this organization is that turnover, right? It's new ideas, it's new vision, it's new problems to tackle. So I hope I'm able to stay here for the whole tenure. I am absolutely intending to, but we'll see what that future brings. But it's an important thing to know, is that's part of the urgency that we drive with this agency. So I tell our PMs, 3 years, that means every 2 weeks that goes by, 1% of your time at ARPA-H is up. And so if you're thinking of procrastinating, just think about that. Like how much closer are you going to be to solving your problem? And that really, I think, drives urgency, not just in the program managers, but that trickles down to the performer teams and to everybody that they're trying to advance the state of the art. And the ultimate one that benefits from that are the patients and American citizens ultimately. And that's really what we're all here for. We're such a mission-driven organization, and it really penetrates through all aspects of how we've established ourselves.
Well, great. Well, thanks again. Thanks for speaking with me, and I hope we can talk again in another year or so and see where you've gotten it.
Absolutely. Sounds great.
Okay.
I appreciate the time.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Brought to you by the 24th Bioequity Europe, scheduled for May 2024 in San Sebastian, Spain. Join BioCentury EBD Group and Regional Host Committee Chair Isio's Capital for biotech's premier CEO and investor conference in one of the culinary capitals of the world.